Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Legatum Institute and the launch of the Wellbeing and Policy Report. And welcome also to those watching online on live stream. It's a great pleasure on behalf of the Legatum Institute to launch this report this morning. And my job is twofold. It's brief. First of all, it's to thank the commissioners. A huge thanks for all they've done over the past year on putting together this report. It's a major contribution to the debate, we believe, and I'd like to thank personally Lord Gus O'Donnell, Professor Lord Layard, Professor Dayton, Martine Join, and Dr. Halpin. We are very, very appreciative of what they've done. It was a bumpy road at times. It was a disagreement at times. And that's actually the second reason I want to talk about why the Legatum Institute has commissioned this report. Right from the outset of the Legatum Institute, wealth and well-being was at the heart of the organisation. Many of you will know that the Global Prosperity Index is unique because it incorporates wealth and well-being. And over the past 5-6 years, the debate about well-being has grown considerably. The literature has expanded enormously, and also, at times, it's maybe generated more heat than light. But it is no doubt whatsoever that this is going to be at the heart of the future debate about economics. There were some very simple catch-all phrases about moving beyond GDP, and there's more to life than money. And we all recognise that. We know that we live in a relational economy and a relational society. But precisely what that means in terms of the policy debate is a matter of considerable debate. There is disagreement. We launched the report in Berlin yesterday, and one of the clear outcomes within the panel, actually, was that people see the whole well-being debate from different ends of the spectrum. Some see it as a case for considerably enhanced intervention by government. Some see it as the pinnacle of interventionism in the 21st century. It's the ultimate there, that the government can intervene to improve your life satisfaction. But others, maybe further on the right on the spectrum, see it more as a freedom agenda and how freedom can enhance well-being and help people and societies to flourish. So we commissioned this report to dig into the heart of that debate. And what you're going to hear this morning is a very rich discussion, I'm sure, as to what that may mean for the future, where the disagreements lie, how there is still huge uncertainty as to not only what the explanatory variables are in terms of well-being, but really what drives them as well. So, a very warm welcome this morning. Hope you'll enjoy the debate. I thoroughly enjoyed it yesterday, and even though I'm going to hear much of the same again this morning, I suspect I'm going to enjoy it just as much. Thank you very much. I'd like to now hand you over to Lord Gus O'Donnell, who is the chairman of the Commission.
Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you. Can you all see me if I sit down? Or yeah, so it's fine. Good. Sitting down will enhance my well-being as long as it doesn't diminish yours. First of all, a big thank you to the Legatum Institute for laying on this event and for commissioning the report. And yesterday we were with the Bertelsmann Institute in Berlin, and that was fascinating to get a German angle. I should stress that the report is agreed by all of us, so don't worry about that. Of course, we are four very key people around me as commissioners, and we have very robust debates, but we've actually signed up to this report, and it's, I think, going to take the debate forward in hugely important ways. And having spent so long in government, I know that this really matters, and there are lots of issues where a focus on well-being will make a difference. And having spent a lot of time in Treasury as well, I know that it's really important that we actually make a point of what Graham was saying. There is more to life than money. We all know that. If you ask people, as they did earlier this week, what should we be doing? Should we be looking at improving well-being for society or improving wealth? You've got 87% saying well-being and 8% saying wealth. So that I think the public have spoken, as it were. Now, these are not contradictory in a sense of what we're saying is we're moving beyond GDP. Income is important. It's particularly important at low levels of income, but there is far more to life than just income. I've just been doing a radio show where they've been talking about careers, and we've got some very important information about careers that maybe David could talk about later. So the whole point of today is to try and get across that idea that actually well-being is a concept that can be measured, can be defined in appropriate ways, and then we can analyze it in great detail and then act upon it. The so what is very important to me. I have spent my time with the commissioners, and it's been fantastic, I must say. We've had great debates developing this report, and the point of it is to actually make a difference. Right? And there are various areas, I think, where it's absolutely clear for me. For example, getting people off unemployment and into jobs is hugely important for their own individual well-being, but also for the public finances. We can take people off very expensive benefits and get them into work paying tax. Mental health issues, massively important for individuals, but also getting the treatment right so we get them back into the workforce, make us a more productive economy, massively important. You think about us, not just us, but actually the vast number of societies that are going through a period where the average age is rising and the numbers who are in retirement going up quite substantially. How do we make that sort of society work? Now, the only reason we can start to even think about some of these questions, and why what David Cameron did, the Prime Minister did, was so hugely important, is that we've now got some measurement, we've now got some data, and the ONS, I'm very pleased to see Jill Matheson here, the head of the ONS, who's actually made a reality of this, that we are now starting to measure well-being. So we can actually give you some information about when people are thinking about what careers to go for. So on average, how satisfied are people with these career choices? That's really important information, allowing people the freedom to make informed choices. Knowledge is more power. So that's really important. What we're talking about here is better government, not necessarily bigger government. So with that, I'd like to hand over to my commissioners. Angus is going to talk about the economics and the analysis and the relationship between well-being and behaviour change and how we define these things. Then Martine from the OECD, who is in fact the person who's made the international, globally comparable ways of defining and calculating well-being possible. Then Richard is going to talk about that whole point about analyse. So we've got define, measure, analyse, and then David will talk about act and some building on some of the great work he's done in the nudge unit. Behavioural Insights team, the formal title. And just to give you one example where well-being, kind of topical really now, I'll finish with. When we looked at one of the issues about the ageing society and well-being this was in the previous administration. One of the things we were very clear about was people not saving enough for their old age. And this resulted in people, pensioners, not having much savings, relying more on the state, and their well-being definitely very low. So how do you solve that in a world where there isn't much money, right? And the interesting part that emerged from the Turner Commission, using the behavioural ideas about the importance of inertia, was to simply switch the default. So I'm now chairman of an economics company called Frontier Economics. They are currently, like companies across the whole of the UK, are in the process of enrolling all their staff in a pension. And what that's doing is basically we're switching the default. So you're opted in unless you opt out. Complete freedom for individuals, but actually we're just setting, to use the jargon, the choice architecture, which governments had chosen in a specific way. Governments had chosen to say to people, you're opted out unless you do something. And of course, for an individual, quite often that meant, so I'm going to sign up for something where I'm going to pay more money. Why should I do that? And actually, as you discuss the opting in, and people now realising, my employer's going to put in a lot more money than me, sounds like a pretty good deal to me. I think I'll stick with it. And so 90% odd of people who've opted in, and the figures we've got so far are staying opted in. That is going to transform their savings, transform their well-being, and really important for the state in that they will not be reliant on the state so much. So there are policies like that that can improve well-being and improve the public finances, and it's just one tiny little example. So, Angus, over to you.
Thanks very much. I get the boring job of being the theorist here, I guess. And they have all the fun telling you what this is all for. That's not really what I do, but anyway, let me start with that. One of the starting points for us, and this is a very, very important part for me, I think I started out being a sort of well-being skeptic. That, you know, I've been an economist for a very long time. I've worked on well-being in a narrow economic sense for a very long time, and I've thought about, you know, incomes and real incomes and prices and all these things. And like a lot of other economists from 20, 30 years ago, I'm not at all sure that we needed to measure well-being or happiness or any of these sort of fluffy, woolly concepts. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I've come to change my mind, and that's to some extent laid out in the report. The standard economic way of thinking about this is a very powerful, simple model in which people know what they're doing. They maximize their own well-being subject to whatever constraints they face. And you don't need to know how happy they are because you can see what they do. I mean, it's sort of what economists call revealed preference. You don't need to do any more than that. There's actually quite a limited role for policy in that, except that within this model, prices sort of indicate welfare. You know, people go out in the market and they buy things up until the point where the price and the marginal utility, you know, those of you who study economics will recognize all this stuff from the very beginning. The trouble for government policy in a lot of that was simply that for a lot of the stuff that governments really care about, like you know, building an airport or building a road, or you know, what do you do about a new train line or stuff like that, there are no very obvious prices out there. These are things that don't go through the market. Indeed, a lot of the time, that's why the government's messing with them in the first place. And so economists fix that by working with what were called shadow prices, which were sort of prices that they made up in order to fill in that gap. And there's a very good theory for that. You can make that all hang together. But it's very difficult to make up those shadow prices, and a lot of them were not tremendously satisfactory, and there was a lot of concern that people could make up prices in their own interests. Was this really objective? Was this well done? And so on. So the way that project evaluation would be done within government, even though it was sanctified by the long use of time, when you looked at it very hard, was not really a very satisfactory procedure. And I think we all knew that, but talking to Gus very early on in this procedure, it became clear that someone who'd sat there doing this knew even better than those of us from the outside just how difficult this was to do. The other thing that's come out of developments in behavioral economics is that you can't necessarily trust people simply. They don't always get things right for themselves, and they make mistakes. And that led to all sorts of complicated issues, and Graham talked a little bit about this at the beginning. Once you realize that people are making mistakes, it opens up a sort of paternalistic agenda, but that disturbs a lot of people too, and your question is, how far are you going to push that? And that's shown up in things like the nudge concept and all this sort of issue. So the other thing that's problematic about the standard way of doing things is simply that it's way, way too narrow. And it's focusing basically on real income. And, you know, real income is great. And, you know, if someone calls on me later, I'll defend real income. I'm not an anti-materialist. I think real income is terrific. And I think it's, you know, hauled mankind out of its brutal, nasty state into something that we have today, which is way, way better. But it certainly isn't the only thing. And you could think of a whole list of stuff. For me, the most important next thing on that list is health, physical and mental health. That has to be built in and integrated into what are people doing. Then there's a whole bunch of other things that are really important to people, including freedom, civic participation, living in a democracy, there's an enormous range. Education is an obviously really, really important thing. And the standard calculus is just not taking those into account at all. So then the question is, can you do better? Now, the science of happiness, as it's sometimes called, or we try to avoid that term, and Martine will talk about that more in the measurement, because we tend to look at life satisfaction or how people evaluate their lives as a target for policy. And even if you come at this as a skeptic and you think, boy, this is not perfect, there's lots of holes in this, you can pick holes in it along the time, but you have to remember how bad it was where we were starting, all the stuff that was being left out, the making up these shadow prices, that sort of doing policy by bootstraps. So maybe these measures of well-being can actually take us to places that we couldn't go before and put us back on something like a firmer ground. Now a big issue of that is the measurement, and Martine will talk about that, but I think we've come to realize that a lot of this stuff really can be measured much better than we thought it was. There's been a tremendous amount of work done over the last 15 or 20 years, and it's accelerating today, and it's moved from a fringe activity in economics into the sort of center of economics. Danny Kahneman has been a really key figure in building that bridge from psychology and fringe economics into the sort of center of economics. And so there's just a tremendous amount of work being done in which we know what the correlates of well-being are, how it hangs together, what bits of it make sense, what bits of it don't make sense. And so we're beginning to have a sort of touchstone which we can use to hold up to policy. Now, for me, there's a tremendous amount of work still to be done. We're not done with this yet. And these correlations which show up in the data are not always policy relevant, and you have to be very careful about how you just jump on this and say, because there's a correlation, we need more of that. And a lot of that work, I think, still lies ahead, and it's being done, and I think it's very exciting, and a lot of people are really interested in it and doing terrific work on it. I wanted just to end with a point that Graham made about the political undertones or overtones. If you think of something like income, we don't usually think of income as being a right-wing or a left-wing concept. It's just out there. Maybe the anti-materialists, there are people who think of income as a right-wing concept or something. But most of us think of income as just something that we need to measure progress. And it's, just part of the debate, and it's used on both sides for all purposes. I think well-being is just saying, okay, you have to have a broader palette than just income. And that is, I think, about as close I don't really believe in the existence of politically neutral anything, but it's about as close to politically neutral as you can get. And I think, it will be fertile meadows for people on all sides of the political spectrum to use this to make their arguments as they've done before. So I don't think, and certainly as far as the Commission is concerned, there ain't no political agenda here. We want to make the world a better place, but not through anything that could be identified as a particular political position. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just to say, for those who don't know Angus well, those of us who are economists and started life as an academic economist, I mean, Angus wrote the textbook on microeconomics. He was the person we all read. He's kind of one of my heroes. And his most recent book, The Great Escape, got to get the plug in there on health, income inequality through the years. I stress you'll more of his ideas there. And the fact that Danny Kahneman got the Nobel Prize. Well, who is in the room next door? Angus Deaton. Right, having said that.
That's not a causal statement.
Purely correlation. And he wrote the book on econometrics, so I have to be incredibly careful about that too. Martine, over to you, who's done, like I say, all of the really important work in measurement internationally.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here. After the boring theorist, I'm going to be the boring statistician here in the room. I must say that as the chief statistician of the OECD, I was very honored to be asked to be on this commission and pleased to participate because, as many of you probably know, the OECD has been working on the issue of well-being for quite some time. And we launched in 2011 our Better Life initiative at the OECD, which the idea was really to try to measure what matters in people's life better, because we know, or we've been measuring GDP, we've been reporting GDP for years, and but is it really what matters to people? We need to look more at the distribution, we need to look more at inequalities, we need to improve on GDP, and so on. And in this agenda, of course, there was the issue of better measuring subjective well-being as well. And despite the centrality of the fact that subjective perceptions to understand what how people behave and what matters in their life, it's fair to say that until very recently, subjective well-being measures were considered largely as something that was not measurable and was outside the official statistics realm. And essentially, those data were collected by non-official statisticians and private companies such as the Gallup World Poll, or by researchers associations such as the World Value Surveys. And even for the few OECD countries that were statistical offices that were collecting these statistics, they were considered, and to some extent still are considered, as experimental statistics. So as if, you know, there was something, as Angus said, woolly and washy, and we didn't want to really enter into this territory. But I think things are really changing very rapidly. Over the last 3 years, there have been an extensive progress in the measurement of subjective well-being by national statistical agencies. And I think while in perhaps 2011, about 2 out of 34 OECD countries were measuring subjective well-being, I think in 2 years' time, there will be almost only a handful of countries that will not be measuring subjective well-being. So progress is really being made very, very quickly. And one reason, as mentioned by Gus, I think, is that the demand for measures of subjective well-being can be expected to grow because there is a policy demand for using such measures to understand more what matters in people's life, to understand more behaviors of people. But I think we should not consider those measures as just alternative measures of GDP, so like, you know, it's just for that. I think it's really to take account the crucial role that this measure will play in policy, and that increasingly policymakers think that are important to consider. And of course, David and Richard will say that, not only to address better people's concerns, but also to offer more choice to people, and I think that will be highlighted later. So the question is, once we've agreed that we should measure this, how do we go about measuring? And that was, of course, a major issue when we at the OECD started to look at that. And I think, as Angus said, often these measures are conflated or simply described as measures of happiness. But I think we have to be careful here, and that's what the report shows, that subjective well-being actually covers more than just happiness. It covers, and in fact, in most instances, when people talk about happiness, or when they refer to subjective well-being measures, they don't talk about happiness. As Angus said, they talk about life evaluation of life that people have about their life and the satisfaction with life, and not about, you know, their real happiness. And this is another concept. So once the framework that we have suggested in this document, which is called OECD Guidelines for Measuring Subjective Wellbeing, is that there are 3 actually broad concepts of subjective well-being. One is life evaluation, satisfaction. How do you evaluate your life today in this current period nowadays? One is about affect, which is more about positive and negative affects, which is whether you feel yesterday, whether you felt hungry or you felt stressed, or whether you felt happy. And this is a different concept, different construct, and aiming at answering different questions. And the last one, which is a bit more philosophical and more complex actually to measure, is what we call eudaimonia, coming back to Aristotle's, and it's much more related to purpose in life. Is the life you're living worth living? Is it worthwhile? Do you feel a purpose in life? And you can see that it's a very different type of question that will need to be asked and put in surveys to answer those different type of concepts and measure this type of concepts. So we propose to have a modular approach to it, and in essence we say, well, for national statistical offices that want to introduce these sort of questions in their standard surveys, they should at least have a module that would, a core module that would cover those three aspects: the life evaluation, the positive and negative effects, and eudaimonia. But if they have to concentrate on one thing, they should all do, because it's proved to be perhaps more useful for policies, is the life satisfaction question. And that's what we recommend as the in the OECD guidelines, but that's also what the report recommends. And the reason is that there is, for those core questions, and in particular for the life satisfaction question, this is where there is the most evidence of validity and relevance, and for which we believe international comparability, which is an important aspect as well, is the most important. So, measuring well-being does not just require having a core set of questions, but also having good survey designs and implementation, because you can, if you don't put the question into a survey that respect those validity criteria, you may get very flawed results on which you can draw from which you can draw very bad conclusions. We know that, for instance, and Angus is very good at telling the story, that in the US, if you ask questions to people after an election, they will respond differently on how they feel about their life as if it was so the context matters. So all these issues are dealt with I'm not going to go through them, are dealt in the chapter, but that's something that is absolutely essential to take into consideration: the sample sizes, the frequency of collection, and so on. However, and I think that's the main point, one of the main conclusions of the guideline is whatever the definition used, we can say that if it's properly done with the proper instruments and if these measures pass the quality test, that sometimes measure that we're currently using actually as official statistics and think they are, hard-nosed statistics, perhaps wouldn't pass. So we should be confident that there is information content in this. And I think we should encourage countries to implement those modules in their regular surveys, because there is validity and information content. So let me now just briefly tell you, now that we've defined subjective well-being, and we've agreed on some concept, what's actually, I told you that many countries are now implementing that, but what's the experience in countries, and how do they go about it? I would say that the experience to date among national statistical offices collecting measures of subjective well-being confirm the views that they can actually be included in official surveys with little disruption to the surveys. In other words, there was a lot of concerns among official statistical office that if you add questions to existing survey, that could deteriorate the quality of the existing questions or surveys. Well, look, it seems to be that that's not the case. Of course, the first very important national statistical office that started to implement this is the ONS, and I'm very pleased that Jill and Glenn Everett are here, because we've been working very closely. We've been working very closely with the ONS at the OECD, and actually accompanying the movement and learning a lot from the experiences of the implementation of those questions in the ONS work. In France, INSEE, the National Statistical Office, is also collecting questions on life satisfaction in their enquête sur les ressources et conditions de vie, and they've also introduced questions on affect and experience well-being in their enquête emploi du temps, which is time use survey. And in particular, like in the US for the American time use survey, they've introduced questions also in their time use survey when people say what they're doing for every 15 minutes during day over a certain period of time. They say how they feel about things that they are doing. And so they're both measuring, therefore, both the life satisfaction but also the affect component of it. The Korean COSTAT Institute is implementing exactly similar questions in the Korean Social Survey, and the Institute of Mexico, INEGI, is implementing the full module of the 3 domains of subjective well-being. In Canada, New Zealand, Italy, this is also going on, and at the EU level, the EU SILK survey, which is a major survey which is undertaken by all EU countries, this will be implemented as a special module for all countries. So that will, again, without any hopefully disruption to to the survey. So now let me just finish with one word. So now that there's more and more data on subjective well-being, is this really being used in policy? Of course, we will hear that in the UK this is the case. I would say that other countries are less advanced, and that's perfectly natural because given that most statistical agencies are only started now collecting this information, it's not surprising that there are currently relatively few examples of subjective well-being measures being actually used in policy making. But I believe strongly that this will change over the years. And two or three examples. Currently, China, which of course is not an OECD country, but is actually starting to collect these countries, is actually looking at how they can use it to try to analyze the negative consequences of extremely rapid industrialization and what is it making to people's well-being. In Mexico and New Zealand as well, they are using this measure to investigate the size of impact of different policies, so sort of cost-benefit analysis. And finally, Singapore, also beyond the OECD, is currently using subjective well-being measure to inform the design and evaluation of prison reform, which is an interesting example. So in April, so in a few weeks from now, we will have a meeting at the OECD among statisticians to present where we stand and to see how this is being used, and we will have a further workshop, more intensive, on the policy uses of subjective well-being at the OECD in June. Just to say that there's a lot of action. As Angus said, there's been it's now being center stage of the economic profession. I wouldn't say it's become center stage of the statistical profession, far from that, but at least it's being increasingly introduced in official statistics. Still experimental, but still a lot of progress is being made on this front. Of course, along with this, a lot of determinants or other aspects of well-being are also collected, such as health, education, social connections, and so on, because it's very important to have a complete picture of what makes for the well-being of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Martine. Just to emphasize that, the reason the Commission were in Berlin yesterday was the Chancellor Merkel's interest in this subject, and her Minister of State was at the meetings, the presentations we were doing at the Bertelsmann Institute. And we're going to be in Paris on Monday talking about this. I've been in Singapore and Canada talking about this. It is becoming much, much bigger around the world. And right, with that, so we've measured it. Now we want to analyse it. Another of my heroes from the economics profession, Richard Layard. And those of you who have anything to do with economics will have read Layard and Nickel, and if you haven't, you should be shocked, because the whole labour market was transformed by this thought that actually what we really need to do is find active welfare policies to get people back to work and find ways to do that. And Richard was at the heart of that. Moved on since to work on well-being, mental health issues, and now fellow member of the House of Lords. Richard, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Since you mentioned this, the only time I met the Prime Minister was shortly after he'd made his speech about well-being, his first speech as leader. And he said to me, and of course I've read your book, and I said, well, I thought you might have done, meaning the happiness book. He said, no, not that one. Anyway, so I want to talk about two things. First, what do we know about the causes of well-being? And then second, how would we use such information in order to evaluate policies, cost-benefit analysis of a new kind? So on the causes, how do we know anything about what causes well-being? Well, obviously, we ask people how satisfied they are with their lives, and then we ask them all sorts of other things, and we see how the other things help to explain who is satisfied with their life and who isn't. And the factors, I suppose, can be grouped into two main sets. One is the external factors of a person's life, like their income, their personal relationships with their family life or their private life, their work life, if they have work or not, how it's going at work, and their life in the community, whether they have good relations with people in the community. That's the external factors. And then there are the internal factors, which are primarily your physical health and your mental health. Now, if you are trying to look at the variation of life satisfaction within a community, you will find that by far the most important sets of factors are the internal factors. And this, I think, is something which wasn't fully realized before we got on to this. So, for example, you could ask, what factors most account for most of the misery that we have in society, reckoned as the bottom section of the population by life satisfaction. And top you will find mental health, even measured many years earlier. Then second you will find physical health. And then of course you will find unemployment and income and poverty, things which I spent most of my life working on. And of course they are important. Being unemployed is as bad as being as losing your spouse in terms of its impact on happiness. It's a very serious thing. But of course, in terms of the scale of the unemployment problem, is not doesn't have the same scale as the mental illness problem. It's just a very much bigger problem, mental illness, and it therefore explains more of the misery than unemployment or poverty. And in fact, income only explains about 1% of the variation in life satisfaction within a country. Similarly, if you said, well, how well can we predict about a child whether they will end up as a satisfied adult? So you can look at various dimensions of their development. You can look at their intellectual and academic development. You can look at how they behave. And you look at how they are inside. Are they anxious? Are they prone to depression and so on? And you might be surprised to know that of these three factors, well, you can guess perhaps where I'm going, of these three factors, which is the best, the most powerful predictor of whether the adult will have a life which satisfies them, it's how they are inside as children. Then next is how they behave as children, and last is how well they're doing in the academic sphere. So if there's anybody here from education, please tell the Secretary of State. These are, I think, very important new ways of looking at things which the well-being approach is giving us. Now, when we look across communities, of course, these personal internal factors cease to explain differences between communities. So the external factors become very important. Income is a very important predictor of the average happiness or life satisfaction in a country. So are some of the more obvious aspects of community life. Freedom is an important one. Corruption is a very important one. In half the countries in the world, people meet corruption every day. Makes a big difference to how they feel. And trust is a very important one. Trust actually within the richer group of countries is very important because it varies a lot. For example, in the Scandinavian countries, if you ask the question, do you think most other people can be trusted? In the Scandinavian countries, something over 60% say yes. And in Britain and United States, it's 30%. Actually, it used to be 60% in our countries. This is a very serious cultural change which has happened over the last 40 years in our countries. But these social factors are, of course, very important in explaining differences between countries. I think, as everybody has said, I think we're at the very beginning of this. Our understanding is these are very crude, broad things that I've been pointing to. But we have a recommendation, which I hope there's... Is anybody here from the ESRC? Oh, good. Yeah. Well, one of my recommendations is the explanation of well-being should be a central objective of social science, and anybody in government or private sector who's doing a survey should please include questions on well-being in it so that we can begin to understand more about these causes. So how, with whatever knowledge we have, could we better evaluate policies than we do at the moment? Some of the policies, I just want to plug this, a little bit of plugging is like. Some of the policies, of course, which get highlighted here, like doing something about people with mental illness, are costing us, the mental illness is costing us so much that some of the policies we can adopt, like the Improving Access Psychological Therapies program I've been involved with, will have actually no public expenditure cost at all. So if it improves well-being, it's a no-brainer. But most public projects do, of course, cost money in net terms. And so we need a new form of cost-benefit analysis where we could evaluate and compare the arguments for one policy compared with another in terms of how much is well-being being improved per unit of expenditure. So what is the bang for the buck would not be GDP increase per unit of public expenditure, it would be well-being increase per unit of public expenditure. And we work out in detail, and the other commissioners were tolerant enough to include an annex on how this would be done for anybody who's interested in cost-benefit analysis. We need to develop new forms of doing that. I'm not saying that this should replace all the existing cost-benefit analysis in money terms, because I do think revealed preference is very helpful in areas where we have well-defined prices or where people are making choices which reveal their values, like in transport. I can't easily see the well-being approach superseding the standard cost-benefit analysis for transport evaluation or for industrial policy. But if you look at most public expenditure, and even if we include education as a primarily economic investment, but if you look at most public expenditure, actually it goes on health, social care, children's services, law and order, and then of course redistribution of income, which can't be exactly evaluated with traditional cost-benefit analysis. So all of these, which can't really be analysed at the moment. I mean, you can write a sort of piece of prose about whether one of these policies is better than another, but it's extremely difficult to write a convincing numerical analysis of why one policy in these areas that I've described is better than another. NICE, of course, have done us a great service by developing the QALY measure. The QALY measure is a sort of well-being measure, and they, as you know, recommend treatments provided they do not cost too much per QALY.
Quality adjusted life year.
Okay, well done. Thank you very much. But in general, we need to develop a new form of cost-benefit analysis with well-being rather than GDP as the measure of benefit. We discuss all kinds of problems about it in the chapter there, chapter 4, including obviously that it might be and I think most of us believe it would be much more important to raise people from the lowest levels of misery than to raise somebody by the same amount who was already happy. We discuss all these issues, and we really hope that we can persuade the government and government departments and analysts here in individual departments to use and start developing these ways of analysing their policy. I'm sure that in 25 years' time, this is how policy will be analysed in Britain. I would be astonished if it's not essentially done that way, and I think it will lead to better policy. But in a sense, so I've spotted one member in the audience here, in a sense, what happens in the policy arena, which is what our report is mainly about, probably ultimately depends on what the public mood is. Is the public appetite for this way of looking at things? Which is one reason why some of us founded a movement called Action for Happiness, I'm allowed to do a plug.
Very quickly.
Very quickly. But it enables me to mention that when Mark Williamson was being interviewed for his job as director, another person who had come along to be interviewed had gone into the web to see if there was any other organisation that had the word happiness in its title. And the answer that came back on his screen was, "Your search for happiness has produced no results."
Okay, so today today we're going to be much more positive than that. But I think what you've heard from all three players is that this is a work in progress and that we are making strides, but there's an enormous amount more to do in terms of measurement and research. Now over to finish off to David Halpern. Now David and I go back a long way. David's an unusual civil servant, right? And when, as a former head of the civil service, you talk about unusual civil servants, they're usually the ones that give the head of the civil service a headache, right? Think of Louise Casey, who I love and has done some really interesting and unusual work, but is generally occasionally more in the headlines than either she or I would have liked. But David is an unusual civil servant in that he's made radical differences to the way policy is conducted through the Behavioural Insight team. And these are, if you haven't heard the long description of the kinds of things that have been done, then you've really missed out, right? And this is going to potentially transform public service delivery in the next century. There are some fantastic ideas. And again, they're generally ones which can be done in a world where, to quote the former Chief Secretary, there's no money. So David has done some brilliant things, but now in the space of well-being, David has also worked very hard on how do we apply the ideas that you've heard of so far to the real world of, well, so what should we be doing? David.
Thank you, Gus. I actually want to just also a quick thank you, but with a purpose actually. There's several people being involved behind the scenes, you and Lisa, Julia and Legatum also. I mention it partly also for a particular purpose, which is that when you see government white papers and green papers, often after they've been more or less written, someone thinks we better have some evidence, and can we add a couple of references? We're sort of slightly nervous laughter for those in government. But actually, in a genuine sense, writing this document, and although I'm quickly going to go through some of these concrete policy implications, they are very much of the Commission, I should say, is that actually there were just reams of papers and studies and work that was gone through, and in order to keep the document short, a lot of those have been left on the cutting room floor. But the point I guess I'm saying is that actually there is really a lot of evidence building up behind this sort of area, and probably rather more than there are for many areas of formal policy that we conduct. Intriguingly, perhaps that's just coming from a new direction. But the point is, for the Commission, and some of you may know, of course, the PM flagged this up early on, but the intention was very much not to have it a party issue, and Gus actually, of course, has been fantastic in that, to make sure that this didn't turn into a party political sort of issue, and actually genuinely what are the policy implications. So that's the intent behind it. But what's the difference between, I sometimes think of an issue which is kind of intriguing, but actually it's just a fact of life. It's not a policy issue. And the main difference is because you can't do anything about it. It would be really interesting to have a conversation about how we should handle the problem of people being aged 200 or 300. It's not an issue, right? It's just the fact that we tend to die at a certain age seems to be a fact of life for the most part. And sometimes people were asking that of the well-being literature for a long time. They were saying, well, it's all sort of intriguing, these results that you find and whatever, but so what? So what for policy? What would we do differently? So you need to crystallize out in quite concrete terms and say, well, actually, there are some things that could be done which would probably have an impact on our life satisfaction and our well-being. And that moves it from an interesting conversation into a genuine policy debate. And I actually think the report has well, you must judge for yourselves, essentially done that. It moved it from those two different kinds of conversations. So there are 4 blocks of things which we picked up in this report, and I'll quickly skim through them. I do encourage you to have a look at them, of course, yourselves. I'm going to slightly relabel to kind of bring it to life. So the first block is we call it mental health and character building, but actually you might think of it as the way we approach life. Actually, the way we approach life is very consequential for our well-being. We start off with the issue of mental health, essentially. So it seems hugely consequential. Gus was using a stat yesterday, I think a very powerful one, just to remind people. In the UK and in Germany, I think this is correct, 3 times more people are likely to kill themselves than die on the roads. I mean, for 40 odd years, we've had incredibly detailed policy work to figure out how our roads can be safer, right? Of course, we do some stuff on suicide, but actually we don't do that much. We reduce the number of paracetamols that you can get in one go. But of course, it goes much more deeply than that. And it is very striking that there are very good, very well evidenced treatments available for the remarkably high prevalence in many areas of mental ill health. And yet, huge proportions of those people never get anywhere near treatment. Right, that is a policy choice, and that's something we can do something about. So actually, Richard, of course, has been leading a lot of the work about psychological therapies to make them get to a wider scale. But still, when you look at that, you have to be also struck by how much further there is to go. Those are real choices that we can make. Another area is, it's clear that a lot of our well-being is, we learn these habits, and we sometimes learn them early in life, and we learn them from our parents. This is an area you can really see that is moving, but we've learned, I think, over the last decade, it is possible to help parents be better parents. And many of you who are parents, right, we realise that actually, particularly when you look back at it and you think, did I do the right thing? And it's a rather puzzling thing. Well, why wouldn't we give help? I mean, particularly, pre-birth, we'll have lots of discussions about what exactly is going on and what you do next, etc. And then after, it's like, okay, now you're on your own, right? I mean, yeah, it's hugely consequential. We know it's just phenomenally consequential. So, for example, maternal depression, first 6 months of life, has these huge impacts on child IQ, actually particularly boys' IQ, it turns out, at age 11, as well as the way in which they approach the world. But we also know that most of those effects look like they can be offset in other ways. So, we talk a lot about, well, what more can we do to support parents? It looks like we could do a lot. And of course, that's an issue which certainly a decade ago would be untouchable from state. Literally, nanny state. Well, is that really, the state should be involved in that, about parenting skills? Well, why not? Richard alluded to the issue about building character and resilience in schools. We don't really doubt the fact that we can teach kids how to do maths and trigonometry and read and write and so on, and it seems a pretty good idea. But there's clearly building evidence, and it's now looking, I think, quite strong, around it is possible in schools to build social and emotional skills. And these are very, very consequential. Of course, they're often immediately consequential in the classroom, because if you have a child who's disruptive and unhappy, actually, it's very consequential for all the other kids as well as themselves. But the fact that you can teach, or teach isn't really quite the word, you can create an environment within which kids can learn empathy, right, and resilience, and think about other ways that you interpret the world. And these are habits and skills which are important for your entire life.
And we should add for the Secretary of State for Education that actually this also increases their exam scores.
Quite a very happy coincidence. And it's interesting, the Educational Endowment Fund, which is running huge numbers of trials in the UK, has itself, partly for that very reason, become very interested in running trials on what you can do with social emotional learning. So things about where you approach life. But then another thing about well-being is that, in fact, one response you might say is, well, that's fine, but a lot of things about well-being are decisions you make yourself, and clearly that's true. So Gus now has the freedom. He doesn't have to go to endless meetings in the Cabinet Office about issues that he may or may not care about. He can decide how he spends his life, and that's a pretty good formula. If you want to be happy, spend your time doing things you like doing. But actually, one of the reasons why the state gets drawn into it is a major impact on our well-being is other people. What a surprise. If someone is rude or unpleasant to you, it actually kind of ruins your day, and it can ruin your life if it's happening on an ongoing basis. It pulls government into it, particularly where you see these patterns of externalities. The reason why governments are involved in skills training and so on and apprenticeships is because of patterns of externalities, right? But that's also true for these habits of well-being. So I think volunteering is a very clear example, quite well shown in the literature now, that unlike income, of course we've heard, and Angus will defend it strongly, the income is important, but it tends actually to have negative externalities, we know. So that, if you come home in your shiny new car, if a neighbour who's still in their bashed up Ford actually feels a little bit less well off and happy. But volunteering works the other way. So if you live in a community with high levels of volunteering and giving, even if you don't do that much yourself, it will tend to pull up your level of well-being. And we know there's lots of things you can do. So in the UK, and there's a table in here, looking at the evidence from National Citizen Service with these really quite striking results on life satisfaction and actually the range of well-being. Because what we don't know yet, although there is indications from the US where the evidence has been kicking around for a long time, it creates habits that last over long periods of time. So if you learn the habits of civility and volunteering earlier in life, they tend to reappear later in life when you have the time to do it. Addressing loneliness, in some ways flip side, in the UK, of course, Jeremy Hunt has raised the issue and raised a lot of eyebrows at the time, but of course it's loneliness. For some people it's, you choose to be alone, but for many people they don't. It's remarkable that more than 3 million Britons over 65 in the UK often don't see anyone, they don't see a friend or a family or neighbour for more than a week at a time. That's an extraordinary thing, and it has palpable effects on well-being. There are lots of things we can do to facilitate social connection if we so choose. We don't hesitate to think about spending lots of money on expensive drugs and so on, but actually we do hesitate to think about, well, what could we do about an issue like loneliness? One of the things in that area, just to conclude the section, is that the physical environment itself actually has very deep consequences for how we interact with other people. In essence, the magic formula seems to be environments that create opportunities for people to bump into each other, water cooler type things, either in buildings or in communities, but don't force people into social interaction, tend to lead to a kind of domino consequence of positive social interaction. So if someone walking outside your front door, in essence, you can't tell if they're a stranger or a neighbour, it makes a big difference as to whether you interact with them. If you're pretty confident they're likely to be a neighbour, you may well interact with them, and that leads to a cascade of consequences over time. Historically, we built a lot of towns, buildings, which do not have those characteristics. If we're about to build, for example, a garden city or two, well, why don't we use that evidence and to systematically say, well, what is it? The forms of environment are likely to build well-being. And a small aside in there, of course, one of those is also some kind of contact with nature. It's often discussed about the relationship to the sustainability agenda, and there is some relationship, but there are also some differences. So it is consequential. Sorry, let's put it the other way. It's not very consequential for carbon, broadly, where you put a tree. It is very consequential for your well-being, where you put it. So just seeing a tree, broadly, caricature, is good for your well-being on a regular basis. Something we can do something about. The next block is around income and work. It's a variant, I suppose, of it's the economy, stupid. It's the character of the economy, stupid, you might put it as, that is being consequential. So the report is quite clear that economic growth is broadly, thank goodness, looks like it's good for our well-being. And you see that particularly when you look across countries. But I think what we also see is that economic growth gives individuals and societies choices about how we spend and use those resources. And one of the things that explains why for countries that are kind of grouped at a given level of wealth or income, they actually have quite a wide spread often of life satisfaction. We don't think, I mean, some of that is artifact, we think in some countries, but for the most part, a lot of that is not just artifact. Those are real differences to do with choices that are being made in those societies. So some of them are quite straightforward. In fact, a live one in Germany has been about active welfare. We take a lot of that kind of read now in the UK, but it's not accepted in the same way in many other countries. If you're trying to decide, for example, in the German context, how to set your minimum wage, you can have some important analysis, and you can read Richard's earlier work to figure out what would be the overall impacts in terms of unemployment and incomes and so on. If, on the other hand, you look at through a well-being lens, it might give you the same result, but it might not at the margin. You might well decide, particularly because the well-being effects of unemployment are so huge compared to the income effects that it will at the margin change the decisions that you make. One might, and Jill may want to comment on it later, but it seems to me quite likely, I assume one of the reasons why life satisfaction has been rising in the ONS data is to do with the resilience of the labour market in an extraordinary sense. The other thing is not just, of course, employment, great, have a job, but also what's the character of your job seems to be rather important too. So well-being at work. The argument has long been made that firms should want to be nice to their workers because they'll be more productive, and actually, empirically, that's clearly true. So clinicians who you put into a good mood before you ask them to make a difficult diagnosis by giving them candy, actually, make more accurate diagnoses and more rapidly. So if you're going to see the doctor, bring some sweets. But it's also that in general, there are things that employers can do which bear on well-being, and it's in their interest, but of course it goes more deeply than that. The last block is around governance, or you might think how we do government is clearly consequential. So in some ways you might think, well, is that completely obvious? Treat citizens with respect and empower them more. But in many areas that is actually quite a radical agenda. If you introduce feedback, as in friends and family tests, for example, on healthcare, it takes you to a different place, right? So the key driver of satisfaction with healthcare looks like being treated with respect and dignity. Now you might hope, well, that's fine, of course I want to come out alive, in my experience with the hospital, but actually being treated with respect and dignity matters very deeply to people, but is probably being systematically underemphasized in a lot of what we do. But freedom, empowerment, control is a key variable for well-being, and it affects also how we do policy, the way in which we consult, the way in which decisions are made, the way in which we might decentralize, give power to people. Of course, measure it. I don't want to dwell on it. We heard a lot about it. That is probably one of the biggest changes that already occurred, certainly in the UK, to start just to put well-being measures in your evaluation, so you can do the kinds of cost-benefit analysis that Rich is talking about. I have to say, I think in some ways, one of the really fascinating radical things that's coming from the ONS data is not because it's useful to government, this is my last kind of the policy issue, but the power of this is that it is informing citizens to make choices for themselves. So there's been some discussion, and as you guys already alluded to, this issue of using the data, and actually Ricky at the back, this fantastic graph in the report. If you're 17, 18, it seems reasonable not only to find out how much you'll get paid as a civil servant or a lawyer or whatever, but also, well, how happy are people in that area? And it's worth thinking about just how radical that is. So our general account of how labour market would be in relation to well-being is that you should go and get a good, well-paid job, and hopefully that income will in fact impact on some way on your well-being. Actually, what's interesting is when you see that data in front of you, you can imagine you're in fact changing the causal relationship a bit. So if people start at the margin making different decisions about what jobs they go to, incomes will be driven by the well-being data, not the other way around. And that's true for a lot of choices. The data itself will change the way that markets operate because it'll change the choices that we make, not by government, just by better informed citizens. So let me just I'll conclude then. So that was a quick list of how is it and will it change policy. Of course, this week was the budget. We were discussing as to whether she should make some comment on or not. The truth is, much as I love my Treasury colleagues, they didn't weigh in great detail probably through all the well-being data before making all their conclusions. But still, at the margin, as is often true, but some of the intuitive judgments that lie behind policy choices actually do ultimately bear on some judgment about well-being. So if you have a view, for example, about certain forms of gambling, I'm going into detail, which give people standing there alone, putting a lot of money into a machine, and what's the well-being impact of that versus getting together and playing bingo with your friends, you might decide one of them is much more likely to have some positive well-being impacts than the other. And that is a legitimate policy decision that you might use when you're setting your budget. I can't swear that the Chancellor weighed through that evidence, but I'm saying there is a logic to it. But more fundamentally, when we look at these things in a short term, we think actually policy doesn't change that much, and the priorities yesterday were pretty much the same as today as they were yesterday. But when you look over longer periods of time, you can see that actually fundamentally, as the priorities of governments do sometimes change quite dramatically over a period of years and certainly decades, often driven by public concerns. And I think this is likely to be true for the well-being agenda. So when you walk down Whitehall, you actually, for those who spend time there, you will see great buildings from enormous grand ministries of state that are long gone. The Admiralty stands there grandly on horse guards, the longest single surviving department of British government, from when, of course, the Navy was a key issue. And it's, where people would have sat there over their charts saying which bit of the world to invade next. Now, in a lovely twist of historic irony, now, of course, it's the world comes to us to get their visas fixed in that building to come to the UK. you know, we're even in the 70s, where, you know, a key job will be Minister for Housing, etc., etc. That would be a key role you'd want. You know, of course, you still have a Minister for Housing, but they clearly don't have the same role and importance, rightly or wrongly, than they did in that period. So what, if you go forward, you know, in a decade's time, what will be a key role? Well, is it serious? Well, you might think actually the Minister for Mental Health might be a really, really key job you would want to do in government. You might well imagine that, I hesitate to say perhaps, but I'll get in trouble, but, you know, maybe, will there be a Minister for Relationships? Seriously, which is actually really concerned about improving parenting and the way we relate to each other. It might really be a key job. And in other areas, we might have the same labels on ministers, but they will be doing different things. In education, is it education or education and fulfillment that we are building in that department? Or in communities, that it's not just about physical infrastructure and transport, but genuinely about the skills involved in building you know, social community, social capital. So I think that on the one hand, you can look at it and think, well, this is all kind of nice and fair enough and sensible. But actually, I think to some extent one misunderstands just potentially how radical this agenda is over a period of time. So I do encourage you to read it. I think it's been a fascinating process for me, and I particularly thank Gus for his involvement and guidance in this whole process. Thank you, Gus.
Thank you, David. Right, we're about to open it up to you, but I should just emphasise that last point, that for me, this is about making I think for all of us, it's about making a difference. And we actually really think this is a massively important subject that could really radically transform and improve people's lives, and that's what we're about. First of all, I just need to say a thank you to Legatum for commissioning this report and giving us the opportunity to do this, particularly to Julia and Shaz for the work they've done with us on the report and presenting it. A big thank you from me to the commissioners. You've heard from them all. I mean, you can imagine what really interesting discussions we had to get to writing this report. So I've learnt a lot, and I hope we've all shared our experiences and learning with each other. We really do want to make a difference with this. All of you in the room can help in that process of getting out the message and seeing what are the areas where, as Richard said, you know, if the demand comes through, the supply will follow. Wasn't that Say's law, I think? No, it wasn't actually. No. As I said it, I realised that it was completely the other way around. So yeah, never trust an ex-economist to talk about economics. But I think it is, to my mind, the people that are supporting this report, the fact that Nick Hurd, I think, is the minister coming out and support is excellent, and we hope to kind of affect the agenda for all parties. I stress I'm a crossbencher, impartial in the House of Lords. I think it's important that we try and get society moving ahead to improve society and to improve people's lives within it. So thank you very much.